So first of all, Jenny, what makes jazz kind of pop-esque today?
What makes jazz pop-esque?
Yes, so like poppy today.
I've always, this is totally in opposition to what I do personally, but one of the things I was attracted to when I was a kid about jazz was that other people weren't into it. It was the opposite of pop music. It made my friends go, "Oh, what the hell is that? What's that terrible music?" I loved as a young teenager, the elitism of it. I loved the fact that no one else understood it, and I was the only one into it. I thought that was brilliant, And I think, by its very nature, a lot of the things that define what jazz is an opposite to pop-esque or pop music. It is, it is long, it is creative, it's not always easy to listen to, it takes a certain understanding. But there are elements of it that can be as thrilling as anything popular. And those elements are the spontaneity of it, the freedom of it, the beat, the swing, the drums, the energy being created by musicians live in front of your eyes. These are the elements that give it an element that can appeal to anyone from a baby to an old man. And I think it's those qualities, I think, that I try to bring to what I'm doing while still occasionally playing pop music. I try and bring that spontaneity, that creativity, that freedom, that conversation between the musicians to a kind of popular form and try and mix it all together and see what we come up with.
You said your friends didn't understand it. What do you need to understand jazz?
Well, I didn't understand it either, but I pretended to understand it. You don't need anything to understand jazz at all, really. You need an appreciation of not always just, I think these days we need everything to be instantaneous. And jazz isn't always instantaneous in its appeal. Sometimes it grows on you. Sometimes it sends an earworm into your brain and cultivates there and works once it's inside you. But I think to understand jazz, it's important to understand that most jazz songs start off with the lead player, whether it's a piano player or a horn player, playing the melody, and then after that, they improvise on that melody, and on that same chord structure, they create new music. And they'll take 1, 2, 3, 4 choruses and then play the melody again. That is the kind of very, very simplistic basis of, say, a saxophone player playing my favorite things. He'll play. He'll play that, the drummer will be playing. He'll play a whole once through the song, and then when he starts again, he won't play the tune, he'll extemporize on the tune. So instead of going, he'll go, like that. And it's based on the melody, but it's hopefully something totally new and expressing something new.
Right, okay. For instrumentalists, is jazz the most satisfying form of music? And if so, why?
I think if you're an instrumentalist, jazz is a very, very satisfying thing to play because not only do you need the technique of, a classical musician where you have mastery of your instrument, you also need to forget everything you've learned and try and do something new. So it is getting all that knowledge as the bedrock and then using it to jump off to all these different places, these new places different places every night. But I think every kind of discipline, every music, every category offers its own pleasures. But I think, as an instrumentalist, jazz can be particularly satisfying because you're always going into new territory every night. The aim is not to repeat yourself, and that can be really thrilling.
Right. I know you play also the guitar, but if you could describe your relationship with your instrument, with the piano.
My relationship with the piano is a bit like, it's like a turbulent relationship. with a partner. You know, it's sometimes we love each other, sometimes we hate each other, and I think, you know, I'm not a great example because I don't have the kind of mastery of my instrument that I'm supposed to have. You know, I think part of the appeal of watching me is that I'm still working stuff out, and I go to places that I'm not always ready to go to, and I think that can sometimes be the joy of it. I don't have this technical mastery at all. I'm still very much a work in progress. So we fight a lot, and I'm always the one who ends up getting bruised. The piano's always fine. It's always me who's in trouble.
Okay. You invoke yourself in Gershwin and you sing Porter as well. What makes them both so unique?
Well, you know, writers like Gershwin and Cole Porter, Irving Berlin, Hoagy Carmichael, you know, these writers within the Great American Songbook, they write with the use of melody and chord structure that is very conducive to jazz playing. They use, I mean, my knowledge of theory is very minimal, but you know, they use this very famous movement of chords and melody, which is known as the 2-5-1. So if you take a scale, 8 notes in a scale, it's the second chord, the fifth chord, and the first chord. Second note, fifth note, and the root note. And because so much of their music is based around this chordal movement, these are basically the basics within the chord structures of jazz. This is the basis of what kind of bebop playing really is. And so, you know, the music written by these people is so conducive to jazz improvisation.
I'm not sure about it, but in Germany we have this big difference between, we call it U&E music, I think you call it series and light music, is that true? How would you describe the difference?
Do you mean within jazz? You know, I would categorize you know, serious and light, or maybe I would say hardcore and smooth. I don't know. When you're talking about jazz, there are different ways you can improvise. One might say if you're playing the light version of jazz, you improvise very much within the chords. You improvise, so none of the notes you play in your improvisation are going to make you go, ah. You know, you're still improvising, but you're improvising very much within the melody, within the chord structure. All the notes, it may be improvised, but it's still very tasteful sounding. If you are getting more into the territory of hardcore and serious jazz, you are not only playing within the melody, but you're playing outside the melody. You take your improvisation to the point where it's not always pleasing to the ear. And that can develop different emotional reaction to the music. This is the area that John Coltrane went into, and Ornette Coleman went into, and you know, Miles Davis and Herbie Hancock. They didn't always play inside; they went outside. And what it does is that it means, you know, when you go outside but you come back inside, it gives you real tension and release. And that gives you a different level of pleasure. But it's not music you'd have on in background at a dinner party. It demands to be listened to. It slaps you around the face and says, and makes a statement. And it's a beautiful thing. And that's not always because it sounds beautiful, but it's because it is like life. Life isn't always perfect. Life takes you outside of the perfect. But then when you get back to the beauty and the perfection, it's all the more beautiful because you've been outside it. And that, for me, is the beauty of great improvisation. And it's not always what I do, but it's when I listen to someone like John Coltrane do that, it's one of the most beautiful sounds you can hear.
You mentioned Coltrane, but you also mentioned Miles Davis. And he's supposed to be the one most people know when they talk jazz. What do you personally feel when you listen to The Birth of Cool or the King of Blue record? What do you think?
Kind of Blue, particularly from Miles, is this is an incredibly listenable record. This is a very tasteful record. Going back to what I said before, you can put that record in the background and it's not going to offend anyone. But what's beautiful about it is that once you get inside the music, the layers of complexity with that music are, it's like looking at a Picasso painting. You know, it can be immediately pleasing to the eye and you can look at it and go, oh, that's beautiful. But when you get inside what has actually been created there, the layers of complexity will take you a lifetime to understand. And how he did that was by, I guess, he took more away than he added within this record. He took chords away, he took structures away, and made it much more open than usual, and created this new form that we know as modal jazz now. So not a million notes, not a million chords, not a million different time signatures. Very, very simple format, which became this canvas for the musicians to create upon. And once they did, they created this incredibly appealing sound with acres and acres of complexity. And it's a record that you can never tire of.
Miles had this cool side as well as the hot side in playing jazz. So which side would you prefer when it comes to
You know, I think Miles is playing. You can't sum Miles up in cool or hot, really. I mean, he was part of that kind of cool jazz scene, which is you know, what you call the West Coast kind of sound, very breezy, very in the pocket. But you know, throughout his career, he was always pushing. You know, and by the 70s, I mean, you know, there was still that sound that you recognise, but the landscape he was creating, and by that point was so different and unrecognisable. He was using electric instruments. He was experimenting with rock sounds, rock drummers, funk rhythms. Jungle sounds, the birth of dance music, the birth of drum and bass music, the birth of electronic music. I mean, you know, Miles is like Picasso. You know, he's started off here and ended up there, but always the same signature throughout it all. But he ran the gamut of creativity.
If you could be the one to fill up the Hall of Fame of jazz of 50s and 60s, who would find a home there and what would they do there?
That's a tough question. I mean, you'd have to have Miles, you'd have to have Coltrane, you'd have to have Dave Brubeck, a great jazz innovator and one of those people who really brought jazz into a mainstream context. You'd have to have Duke Ellington as a composer, as a musician. You'd have to have Thelonious Monk, a total individual with his angular, maze-like compositions. You'd have to have Bill Evans, you know, the Mendelssohn of the piano, jazz piano. You'd have to have Ella Fitzgerald as a jazz singer, proving what you could do with the voice. I mean, the list is endless. I mean, the 50s and 60s are the most fertile period for great jazz music. 40s, 50s and 60s for me. When you go back into the 30s and the 20s, you get into the more traditional area, which is you know, the birth of the music. But you really start to see it just develop so quickly in the 40s and 50s and 60s.
Let me give you a name like Lee Konitz.
Well, Lee Konitz, you know, there's a player who, you know, operated from a real bebop standpoint, who then took it to more, we would say, serious, hardcore, very angular, more into the free territory, shades of Ornette Coleman, but still with the kind of musicality and the more bebop and cool sounds of someone like Parker, but still, pushing it further in a more Ornette Coleman kind of way.
Klaus Dollinger?
I don't know anything about Klaus Dollinger.
Okay. Sérgio Mendes?
Sérgio Mendes, great Brazilian musician, very much someone who fused the sounds of his home with his knowledge of jazz, a real innovator in that sense.
And Dizzy Gillespie?
Dizzy Gillespie, one of the architects of bebop music with Charlie Parker, not only as a musician but as a composer. He composed a lot of the great bebop standards that we know, along with Charlie Parker, but also just as one of the great innovators of improvisation as well.
Okay. That's tough. You have Asian and Israeli roots, and jazz is kind of described as black music. Is it important for you? Does that make any difference, or does it give you another access because of your background?
I think I grew up in a very rural part of England, very white part of England, and I had quite an exotic family by comparison to where I was living. When my Indian and Burmese relatives would come to visit, it was definitely quite different to where I was living and where I was brought up. And when I discovered jazz, I was very conscious of the blackness of it, which was, again, very much an anathema to where I was living, where I was brought up, and I was fascinated by that aspect of it. I didn't make links within my family, within the kind of cross. Just trying to think of a way to describe it. I didn't really make links with the fact that I had a family from an exotic, with an exotic past, versus the kind of the kind of black jazz I was listening to. All I knew was that it was a world that I didn't know much about that fascinated me, and it was something that I found really different and exciting. But it didn't really kind of tick any boxes for me from necessarily from where I came from.
A lot of big jazz records are instrumental pieces, and how do you see the relation between the voice and the instrument? Can the voice be an instrument as well?
I think the voice can definitely be an instrument in the world of jazz in the right hands. If you need to ask someone like Bobby McFerrin that question. Mark Murphy, Kurt Elling. These are people that treat jazz singing as it should be, which is where the voice is not just the voice that sings the pretty song and then leaves the instrument to do the improvisation. These are guys that improvise properly with their voice, and use it to such a degree where someone like Kurt Elling is the John Coltrane of the voice. John Hendricks. Ella Fitzgerald used her voice very much like an instrument to really, really improvise. So yes, it very much can be on a par with instrumentalists.
And the relationship between the voice and the instrument?
I think jazz singing can sometimes get a bad rap because, as I said, sometimes people consider the jazz voice just to be the person who sings the song, and people like Kurt Elling really do prove that these days that the jazz singer needs to bring his game in the same way that the saxophone player does. He needs to bring his A game in terms of improvisation, because otherwise the jazz singer is going to permanently get the reputation of just being the pretty singer, and in jazz, that's not always the way it needs to be.
How does Didi use her voice?
Well, Dee Dee Bridgewater is, the perfect example of a singer who holds her own with the instrumentalists, because her voice is like an instrument. She can do anything with it. She can improvise. She doesn't sing anything the same way twice. She's a horn player, but also when she needs to, she can be the torch singer as well. So she's the example of a great jazz singer.
If you compare instrumental jazz and abstract art, and they kind of lose their meaning or might have no directly subject matter, is that their strength or their weakness?
You can go to jazz concerts that seem to have no center, that seem to have no obvious structure. Free jazz is like that, where you throw away obvious clear structures and you go into the unknown, and there's no anchor. And abstract art can be like that as well. You look at an installation or a painting or a sculpture, and it seems to have no center. What do you hook onto? With a pretty painting, at least you have the immediate beauty of it. But with abstract art and abstract jazz, there's nothing to hold on to. And I think then it's more about being able to let go yourself. It's about the way the audience responds to it. It's the job of the audience to feel free enough to go with it and not have to feel like they're comfortable. And I think, these days in our modern world, we need to be led by the hand, and we need things to be instantaneous. And of course, the lasting impact really comes from things that pull the rug out from under your feet and make you go to new places. And abstract art and free jazz can really do that. But you need to be willing. You need to frighten yourself. You need to be willing to go there. You need to be willing to free yourself.
How free can you be with it?
As a player or as an audience?
Or how far can you go? I think as a player.
Well, as a player, there are elements. I try to go to places that are unfamiliar for me and for the audience. I try to take the center out from the music sometimes and express something that has no obvious goal in mind, other than just the joy of expressing something. And that can be thrilling for me. Sometimes you can lose your audience, but then it's fun to bring them back to a place that they're more familiar with. But you just need to feel that freedom, and you need to feel fearless, otherwise it'll be a nightmare.
The Count Basie Orchestra, you worked with them, and how was that? What is so special about them that you wanted to work with them? What was their reference in the jazz history?
Well, the Count Basie Orchestra, they have a sound. I think that's the best way. In the same way that when Louis Armstrong picks up a trumpet and he plays and it's him, the Count Basie Orchestra have a sound which is, there's no need to describe it in theoretical terms. It's just when you hear the Count Basie Orchestra play, it's them. And on this particular tune, I wanted that Count Basie sound. And I got it.
And how difficult was it to work with them? I mean,
well, this is the thing about a band like the Count Basie Orchestra. It is not, assuming you are bringing your A game, it is not difficult to work with them. They need to work with people who are able to do their thing and make their mark on the music. And I was nervous that I wouldn't be able to make an impact within such a definite sound. So I really had to be conscious of bringing a very distinct personality to their music.
When you talk jazz with Clint Eastwood, what binds you or what separates you in your access to jazz?
There was very little that separated myself and Clint Eastwood when we talked about music, because I think he is a proper music fan. he is not a casual music fan. He knows his music with an extraordinary depth, to the point where he really could have been a musician for a living instead of a filmmaker, instead of an actor. And his willingness to enjoy music that is outside of his comfort zone is very, very apparent as well. And it's extraordinary to hear him talk about music, because not only is he able to talk about music like a real music fan, but he's normally got a story about one of the musicians from his own personal life. So you talk about Miles Davis, and then he'll tell you a story about how he went out on the town with Miles Davis in New York in his Ferrari once. And you see that, there's an added level of excitement talking to Clint about his understanding of music.
Okay. The late 50s and 60s still were those years of the great jazz singers like Nancy Wilson, Dinah Washington, Nina Simone, etc. Who would be your favorite of them?
I think of that, group of singers, I really relate mostly to the rawest work of Nina Simone, because she has the element of the rock star about her, the unpredictability, the rawness, the imperfection. Things like Cinnamon, 8 minutes of rhythm and improvisation and unpredictability, and not always pretty sounding. There's a real rock star quality to what she does, and you know it's her immediately. There's always rough edges with what she does. As beautiful and as perfect as it is in some ways, there's always a rough edge. There's always the sound of the revolution in her voice.
Okay. Are you into bebop music?
Yes.
What makes it? My boss writes about. What do you think about Charlie Parker? Can you explain his artistic input?
Well, Charlie Parker is if you take Charlie Parker away from jazz, it's like trying to make bread without flour. Charlie Parker is as much the architect of what we know of jazz music as Louis Armstrong or Sidney Bechet or Jelly Roll Morton. Charlie Parker is one of the architects of what we know as bebop music. He took the beginnings of jazz and turned it into what we know jazz of as today. He developed a greater harmonic complexity. He developed a greater rhythmic complexity. Without Parker, there is no jazz really.
Do you like cool jazz? How does that appeal to you?
Well, the cool jazz sound is a very appealing sound. It's very laid back. It's like the coast it was created on. The West Coast. It's sunny. It has a lighter, less dense sound than the kind of more East Coast bebop sound. It still has harmonic complexity and rhythmic complexity, but it's just cooler. It's called cool jazz for a reason.
All right. And the name like Lennie Tristano?
Well, Lennie Tristano, the piano player, he brought the sound of the Professor to the music, and not just in complexity, but his compositions and his playing were always had basis in some kind of intellectual game. His tunes always had a kind of intellectual crossword puzzle about them.
I mean, you said professor, you said you need to understand it. Do you need a special knowledge to go into jazz music? I mean, it always sounds like it's the, most... You have to be well educated to get into jazz, isn't it?
No, I think the secret is with jazz is that it can, the great jazz can be instantly appealing whether you know nothing about it at all. But the beauty of it is if you choose to engage and choose to delve deeper into the music, it keeps yielding more and more to you. I mean, you know, much like the Beatles, you know, you can have the Beatles on in the background, you can engage on it on a surface level, but if you choose to go deeper, you'll be rewarded.
Another piano player who influenced the 50s MC is Art Blakey with his jazz messengers. Do you like his style? Because I think it's kind of hardball. Art
Blakey is, you know, one of the most important drummers and band leaders of the in the world of jazz. He led a group called the Jazz Messengers for many years, which was constantly changing its personnel. And within the personnel of the Jazz Messengers are most of the greatest jazz musicians of all time. You know, Lee Morgan, Horace Silver, even Wynton Marsalis. All these players went through the Jazz Messengers, led by and encouraged by the great tutor, the great swinger, the great rhythmic genius, Art Blakey. And, you know, without him, the landscape of the music would look very different.
Many white so-called hipsters emulated the jazz cat lifestyle in the slang, the attitude, the fashion, sexual behavior, if you think Norman Mailer. Can you understand this fascination? Are you attracted to any of that?
You know, I think when jazz, you know, particularly when bebop and when it started to kind of come out, I think it was very much a kind of hipster world, very much a world that chose to be outside of the norms of everyday society, and of course, you know, a lot of wannabe white guys were attracted to that world because it was cool and it was different. You know, they wanted to be part of the gang. Am I attracted to it? I mean, I think when I was a kid, I saw the jazz musician as a world of the outsider, and that appealed to me. You know, I was an odd kid, and it appealed to me.
It's funny because Didi said, like, every white person wanted to be black and kind of adapted.
Yeah, well, I think you see that in the world of, you know, these days I think you see that in the world of hip hop music. You know, maybe we're past that now, but of course it's a world that's created within a certain culture, and you know the culture that's outside it sees it, and it seems cooler than what they're doing. So of course you want to be a part of it.
Like this morning in the cafe where they played your song where you sing "The grass is always green." Beat literature from writers like Alec Ginsberg, Burroughs, is said to be influenced jazz. Did you ever read one of their books?
I did. My interest in beat culture and beat literature was directly part of my interest in jazz. Around the time I got interested in jazz was the same time I started reading Kerouac and Ginsberg. I was about 14, 15. Very typical for a kid getting interested in literature at that age to kind of be blown away by that whole scene. Gary Snyder and William Burroughs and all those people. So yes, I did read all that, you know, the Subterraneans, On the Road, the Dharma Bums, and I would reread the sections about jazz, and it all fed into a whole period of my life that was very much interested in beat poets and jazz music.
What did it give you then?
It gave me a world that I didn't understand and knew nothing about. It was different. It was fascinating.
There was a big blast of creativity in jazz during the civil rights movement. So how political is jazz to you, if it is?
I think you know, jazz. You know, jazz is from where it's come from is the sound of freedom. You know, it was born from slave music, and you know, this is a world I can read about, but of course have no experience of. You know, it's a distant It's a distant world that I don't know about. And jazz continued to be the sound of freedom and the sound of the voice speaking out from the repressed world. And I think that's what gives it so much power. I think these days, when it's created by musicians that have no experience of that, there is still, you still try to give it the sound of freedom, the sound of breaking out of something. But of course, my experience of it is very different. But I certainly respond to the music that was made directly from the civil rights movement. There's a famous Max Roach album called The Freedom Suite, which is the sound of the civil rights movement, if you've ever heard it. Charles Mingus, his jazz music was the sound of the civil rights movement. Wynton Marsalis still very much makes music that speaks from that perspective. His Blood on the Fields music is very much tapping into that, and it's beautiful, and it is the sound of something very true and very just that reverberates down the passage of history.